This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you. Okay, just to let you know, the reason I don't use PowerPoints is so many of my colleagues have been telling me that when I use them, they just get in the way. So, there are a couple of places where PowerPoints would be useful, but you all have good imagination, so we'll work on that. So let me to start with, I want to share with you what one of my major concerns are now as we think about the future in food and agriculture issues. And as you probably gathered from the introduction, I've been involved in sustainable agriculture now for 40 years of my life. And during that whole time, and even today still, most of my colleagues who are engaged in sustainable agriculture are thinking about it in terms of how do we make the current system a little less bad. And you know, whether you're into sustainability, thinking about that in terms of simply intensifying what we're currently doing more, which is of course one school of sustainability, or if you're feeling that everybody should go organic, or if you're feeling that what we really need to do is become more environmentally sound, etc., it's still all operating under the notion that the basic system we have out there, the modern industrial system, is okay. We just have to fix it a little bit. And my point of view is that as we really think about sustainability, we have to think about future challenges. And that approach to sustainability is not going to work for reasons that I'll go into in some detail in a bit. But one of the resources that also helped me really think about this and this kind of transition that we need to think about is, the World Watch Institute now publishes a State of the World report every year. And in each of they choose a different theme. And the State of the World report in 2013 was entitled, "Is Sustainability Still Possible?" And the lead essay, the lead chapter in that collection of essays, and the collection of essays, in my view, are always really quite good. There's usually a diversity of group of people that contribute to each of these annual reports. And all of the essays in that report were good. But the lead essay was written by Robert Eagleton, who at that time was the president of the World Watch Institute. And he coined the phrase for his lead essay, "Sustainababble." And the title of the essay was "Beyond Sustainababble." How do we get beyond sustainababble? And I always thought that was a really good way to frame this. But then he pointed out that, we now have all of these different views of sustainability, which he says it reflects a cacophonous profusion of the uses of the word sustainable to mean anything from environmentally good to cool. And he points out that this is an approach which has a high cost because frequent and inappropriate use lulls us into dreamy belief that all of us and everything we do and everything we buy and everything we use are enabled to go on forever without end. Amen. And I think that's a really good statement about where we are today. And so this state of dreamy belief is what we have to get beyond, and we have to really address some of the key issues that we're facing. So one of the things that has helped me a lot to frame this, how do we now begin to think about sustainability in a more appropriate, defensible way? And one of the resources that's been helpful to me in thinking about this is an anthropologist who published a book back in 1989 by the name of Ernest Shusky. And the title of the book that he published is called Culture and Agriculture, An Ecological Introduction to Traditional and Modern Farming Systems. And as you would expect from an anthropologist, what he does is ask the questions, how have we as humans fed ourselves ever since we've been on the planet? And here's where a PowerPoint slide would be useful, and I actually have one, but gearing everything up for that, and you all have good imagination. So what I'd like to have you think about now is the timeline of human history. So if you see the timeline of human history all the way across the screen here, and Shusky points out that as full-fledged human beings, we evolved on the planet about 200,000 years ago. Now, you can take it farther back than that if you want to go back to the Neanderthals, et cetera, a million years, 1.5 million years, whatever. But if you want to think about it in terms of when we were what we see ourselves as today, as full-blown human beings, about 200,000 years ago. So he points out that for the first 200,000 years, or the first 190,000 years, we fed ourselves as hunter-gatherers. So if you think of this timeline of human history, you have to go at least about halfway or a little better than halfway across the screen, right? So we fed ourselves as hunter-gatherers. And he points out that feeding ourselves as hunter-gatherers was the most efficient energy system, food system we ever had. That we were producing about 20 kilocalories of food for every 1 kilocalorie of the energy that we invested in making that food available to us. And then about 10 or 12,000 years ago, he argues, is when the Neolithic Revolution started, in which we started to do agriculture. And then instead of simply going out into nature and hunting and gathering what nature provided to feed ourselves, we started to manipulate nature. We started to do cultivation, we started to domesticate plants and animals, and started to feed ourselves from that. And as he points out, this was a very land-intensive kind of agriculture, because we relied, first of all, on the natural fertility in the soil, and then in addition to that, we primarily did and this is not every kind of agriculture, but the majority of agriculture was the slash and burn agriculture, where we would cut down and burn the perennial plants that were out there, and then the ash from that, plus the natural fertility, would provide fertile environments in which to grow our food for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then we would abandon that and slash and burn another place and raise our food. He argues that from an energy efficiency point of view, this was much less efficient. We were now only getting about 10 kilocalories of food for every kilocalorie of energy that we invested. So if you think of the timeline of human history, you go about halfway across the screen and then probably another 2 inches, which is that 10,000 years when we started to do agriculture. And then he argues, and this is the important point that I want to make here, that in the early 1900s we entered into a third era of agriculture, which he called, I think appropriately, the Neocaloric Era, because it's entirely based on old calories. And then he argues that this will of necessity be a very short period of time in the timeline of human history, so you can think maybe a half inch or less on that timeline of human history. And that's the agriculture or that's the food system that we're involved in now. And then he points out that this neocaloric period is the worst energy efficient system we've ever had. We now only get about 1 kilocalorie of food energy for every 10 kilocalories of energy that we invest in making the food, putting the food on our tables. And so as we think about these old calories which support that system, as they no longer are available to us, and we have this terribly energy intensive system, we're in serious trouble. So if we really want to be serious about sustainability, this is the picture we have to think about. So that's what I want to address with us in the few minutes that we're going to have together today. I should also mention that, when you read Ernest Shusky's view, you could kind of like, so we were hunter-gatherers, and then one day we woke up and said, oh, let's be agriculturalists now, and then one day we woke up and said, let's be neocaloric producers now. And as Colin Tudge points out in his book, Neanderthals, Bandits, and Farmers, How Agriculture Really Began, that's not the way it happened. It happened over a period of time, that even when we were hunter-gatherers, we started to do some manipulations, of nature to try to produce more, etc. And even when we shifted from the Neolithic period to the Neocaloric period, farmers didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, we're going to start using all these inputs now. That happened over a period of time, probably really started in 1840 when Justus von Liebig, published his paper about how we didn't need to involve ourselves in the laborious process of maintaining the health of our soil anymore. All we needed to do is put in the 3 inputs, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then we could produce all the food that we needed. And then it really took us, about half a century to really fully adopt the neocaloric period. But in any case, the system that we have now is based on a paradigm which is really true of all of the industrial economy, and that's maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. And every farmer knows that that's what the paradigm he or she has to operate under. And so what that means is that you have to think about this in terms of how you accomplish that maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. And of course, the way you do that is you specialize, because that's more efficient. You simplify your management, and you go for economies of scale. And an individual who was very much at the heart of this was Henry Ford. And some of us probably didn't know that Henry Ford actually grew up on a farm just outside of Detroit. And he had already been adopting those principles in the farming operation, and then took those principles when he established the first automobile assembly line. So he once famously said that people could buy any car they wanted as long as it was a black Ford Model T, because that was the only one he was going to produce, because that was more efficient. And then, of course, he didn't teach every one of his employees to put a whole automobile together. He taught each one to just do a simple piece of it, and it came through the assembly line. And then he was insistent on producing enough cars so that even all of his employees could afford to buy one. That was the economies of scale. And then that concept became adopted in agriculture, and especially after the Second World War. And when you drive through Iowa now, for example, you don't see 40 different varieties of crops the way we used to grow back in the 1940s. It's just 2 now, just corn and soybeans, and that's it. And that's, again, that specialization, management simplification. One of the reasons that GMO crops became so popular, especially on things like soybeans, is that when you use Roundup-ready soybeans, you don't have to have all that complex management of trying to figure out exactly when the weeds are coming and how you're going to control them. You just go out there and you plant your soybeans, you wait till the weeds come up, one spray of Roundup, and the weeds are gone, and the soybeans grow on their own. That's the simplification. And then, of course, economies of scale. Average farm sizes, used to be about 1,000 acres in Iowa. And now we actually have one 40,000 acre farm, and a lot of the farms are 5,000 and 10,000 acres. So the question we really need to ask is whether or not this direction that we've taken and this kind of specialization, simplification, and economies of scale continue to be sustained into the future as we meet these new challenges that we're going to be facing. So what are some of those challenges? Well, the first challenge obviously is energy. Our current system, not only in agriculture but our whole industrial economy, is absolutely dependent on cheap energy. The amount of energy that we're currently using is unprecedented. And we've had this cheap energy because we've had stored concentrated energy, primarily in the form of fossil fuels. When you have stored concentrated energy, all you got to do is you expend the energy to dig into the earth and extract that energy and then process it and make it available. And back in the 1930s and 40s, we sometimes forget, I think, that the first oil well in this country was in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. So it was about 150 years ago. And then we didn't go to the oil economy the next day. It took about 40 or 50 years to really get fully into the oil economy. So we've really only been in the oil economy for about 100 years. Again, a very short period of time. But during that period of time, it's been these cheap fossil fuels that have driven not only our whole economy, but especially our food system. So now, and right now, as we all know, the oil prices have gone down, but I don't need to go into detail of why that's happening. It sort of didn't work out that well for Saudi Arabia anymore, so they started producing as much as possible. So this is a short period of time in the energy picture, and at some point these oil prices are going to go up. T-Bone Pickens, who's an oil guy, he told us about 8 years ago that we should expect that crude oil will hit $350 a barrel within 10 years. So we've got a couple more years to get to that point now. He probably didn't anticipate, the additional oil from fracking and all of that, and even if you discount some of the ecological damage from that, et cetera, that can't continue indefinitely into the future. So at some point, the oil will be $350 a barrel. And the question I like to ask, and I spend most of my time talking with farmers, and I really prefer to talk to a mix of farmers, some conventional farmers, some organic farmers, some CSA farmers, some market farmers, market farmers, around the same table. And then instead of getting into an argument about who's right and who's wrong, what I like to do is to say, okay, let's imagine that 10 years from now, crude oil would be $350 a barrel. And let's imagine that fertilizer prices are 10 times what they are today, because we're also drawing down all of our natural resources. And if you want to read a really important book on that, Ugo Bardi, who's now published a new Club of Rome report called Extracted, in which he goes into great detail about all of these mineral resources and these other natural resources on which we've absolutely depended for our industrial economy, are now essentially becoming distracted. And then Michael Clare also published a book called The Race for What's Left, in which he also goes into great detail on all of these resources that we've been absolutely dependent on in our industrial economy are now becoming depleted. And he presents a scenario which is very convincing that we could end up going into a series of resource wars to grab those last ones that are left. So we would use the remaining resources to fight over the resources. And we still want to call ourselves Homo sapiens, but nevertheless, these are all possibilities that we have to think about. And then in addition to that, you add the fact that we're drawing down our freshwater resources all across the planet. And of course, water is essential. Currently we're using 70% of our freshwater resources just for agriculture irrigation. And part of that is because, of course, we haven't paid attention to what Sir Albert Howard reminded us we needed to do, and that was pay attention to the biological health of our soil. So our soils don't absorb. Most of our soils now have become so degraded they only absorb about a half inch of rainwater an hour, and so the rest of the water runs off. And so we have to use more irrigation. But we're drawing down our freshwater resources all across the planet. And then, of course, we have to add the big elephant in the room, and that's climate change. And all of these are connected because climate change, to some extent, is the result of the fact that we haven't managed our natural systems in ways that are self-renewing and self-regulating. And so we have to begin thinking now about a future in which we take all of those kinds of things into consideration. So now you can probably come to the conclusion pretty quickly in ways I said, oh God, it's all going to hell, there's nothing we can do about it. So I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about a different kind of future, which I think is possible for us. And one of the things that we have that's useful to us, that we do have some wisdom from the past about how to do things differently in a more sustainable way that actually can accomplish a kind of sustainable, and again, we're going to concentrate primarily on our agriculture and food system. And one of those pieces of wisdom from the past is from Sir Albert Howard. Sir Albert Howard already, and he published this book, An Agriculture Testament, back in 1943, and he already understood back then that this direction that Justus von Liebig put us on, of simply going back to using these few synthetic inputs instead of paying attention to biological soils, was the wrong direction. In fact, he referred to what he called the NPK mentality. He referred to that as a form of banditry, because it was going to steal biologically healthy soils from future generations, and this was not conscionable. And so in his book, on page 4, and his alternative to this was to farm the way nature does. And on page 4 of the Agriculture Testament, he puts that concept into a summary paragraph, which is a very short paragraph, which I've always thought is a great concept, a great statement for how we need to think about how we're going to redesign our food system for the future. And here's how he put that. He said, we can summarize this in a few words, and what we need to do is to partner with nature rather than to subdue or ignore nature, with the way Wes Jackson would put it. And so here's what he said. He said, Mother Earth never attempts to farm without livestock. So animals are always a part of a self-renewing, self-regulating system. She always raises mixed crops. There are no monocultures, or at least very few monocultures in nature. Great pains are taken to preserve the soil and to prevent erosion. That's how nature functions. The mixed vegetable and animal wastes are converted into humus, and there is no waste. Everything gets recycled back into the system in nature. The processes of growth and the process of decay balance one another. Ample provision is made to maintain large reserves of fertility. And again, even since we started to do agriculture 10,000 years ago, it was those reserves of fertility that we depended on for producing our food. The greatest care is taken to store the rainfall, and both plants and animals are left to protect themselves against disease. Now, some of my colleagues take exception to that last statement. You mean we just ignore plants and animals? We don't attend to their health anymore? Well, this is not what he's saying. What he's really saying in his view is that if you manage your farming systems the way nature does, then the natural immunities and health of the animals and the plants will pretty much take care of themselves. So you don't need to bring in resources from outside to do that. Now, the one piece that's missing from his analysis, which I'm sure Wes Jackson would want to add, is that nature operates on the basis of perennials, not annuals. And so if we were to think about this concept of agriculture, and how do we, with all of our resources that we have at our disposal today in our modern world, how could we use those resources to create a farming system that operates under this principle of farming the way nature does? That, I think, is a huge challenge for us, and it's a challenge that I think is one that we can address and one that we can come up with, and I'll mention a few details on that in a bit here. A second wisdom from the past is somebody that's all known to you here at Cornell, and that's Liberty Hyde Bailey. And among his many publications was his book, The Holy Earth, in which he said what we need to do now in our agriculture system is to come up with this new hold. We have to have this new internal motivation that helps us to recognize that nature isn't just a resource out there for us to exploit and use, but we have to treat it as kind of a sacred resource, a holy earth. And we have to learn to relate to that earth in a way that sustains its health and its vitality. The holy earth is again, I think, one of those resources that most of us should go back. And this year, 2015, is the 100th anniversary of the publication of that. And my understanding is that Counterpoint Press is going to publish a new edition of The Holy Earth, and Wendell Berry is going to write the introduction to that. So we might want to take a look at that as a new resource, for our students, et cetera, and have some conversations about, again, that wisdom from the past. And then you can also add to that list Aldo Leopold, who's one of my heroes. And Aldo Leopold was actually influenced by the writings of Liberty Hyde Bailey, but even more so influenced by his own observations of nature and how nature functioned. And he came up with this notion that we now have to think about the land not so much as a commodity belonging us, but as a community to which we belong, and that we humans are simply plain members and citizens of this biological community that makes up this dynamic land community. And then he developed, out of that concept, he developed his land ethic, but you all know, so I don't need to repeat that. But then he ended up saying, so how are we going to implement this land ethic? And a land ethic isn't something that's just written. It's something that has to be internalized in us. And so he came up with this concept of what we have to do now is to develop an ecological conscience. A conscience in which we all recognize that land health is an issue that has to be as important to us as any other kind of ethical consideration. But how do we develop this ecological conscience? And that's where he realized this was a difficult task. And that you couldn't simply do this, by writing about it or by talking about it, that this had to be a product of social evolution. But an ecological conscience is a conscience about land health. And land health, in his view, was the land's capacity for self-renewal. So how do we begin to relate to the land in a way, and by the land he doesn't just mean the fields out there, he meant the entire biotic community. How to relate to the biotic community in a way that it is self-renewing. And again, this is critical to how we think about the future of our food and agriculture system. So there's some others, that we could talk about. Let me just leave with those three. But we do have this wisdom in the past. And then we have the science of ecology and evolutionary biology. And unfortunately, in agriculture, we have applied almost none of the insights and resources and research from the science of ecology and evolutionary biology and agriculture. And in my view, if we married that wisdom from the past with what we've learned from the science of ecology and evolutionary biology, I think we could come up with incredible new design systems for a future food and agriculture system. And that's what I'm trying to encourage the land-grant university that I'm involved with and others of us who, because I think this is a critical role which our university community can address. And when you think about it in terms of the science of ecology and evolutionary biology, a couple of things stand out, not only from that science, but also from some of the things that we're learning at the practical level now, is that critical in this new design of our food system is restoring the biological health of our soil. And you have here great resources in that in terms of Vaness, who has been working with Fred Magdoff and others in developing actually some metrics for how we measure soil health. But we need to really begin to address that and figure out how we apply that and how we begin to work with farmers, and not only farmers but other people in the food system, because if we're going to restore the biological health of our soil, we can't continue to do maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. We have to come up with a new paradigm, and farmers can't do that on their own. We have to all become involved in that because we have to create a new food system. And that new paradigm is more a regenerative, resilient food system for reliable long-term return. That's an entirely different paradigm. But we can do that, and we know how to do that, and if we redesigned our food system, it would encourage farmers to move in that kind of direction. And so that I think is part of what we need to address. And again, we have some interesting resources here. And again, I don't have time to go into all of them, but one that has really inspired me over a long period of time is an essay that Joe Lewis and his colleagues, and Joe Lewis was the leading pest management specialist in the Agriculture Research Service for I think almost 50 years. And in 1997, he and his colleagues published an article in the National Academy of Sciences proceedings. And their point in their article was, after 50 years of experience, he said, we now know that single tactic therapeutic intervention strategies for solving pest problems are not sustainable. Because, as they pointed out, if you have a pest problem and you have this single tactic, you come in with a pesticide, the therapeutic intervention to get rid of the pest, that's not sustainable, because what happens is you never get rid of all the target pests, so you create pest resistance, and you not only harm the target pest, but you also harm other biological organisms, some of which previously served to help suppress pest emergence, so you're actually causing pest resurgence. So this is not a sustainable approach. And then they point out in the middle of that article, they have about 3 paragraphs, and they said we should not expect any other different results from genetic engineering than we do from chemical technology, because it's the same paradigm. We're still doing single tactic therapeutic intervention to solve a problem, rather than what they said what we have to do now is to transition to natural systems management. And they finally end up at the end of that article with 2 questions which I've always loved. They said, instead of asking how do I get rid of the pest, what we have to ask is why is the pest a pest? And then that leads us to redesigning the system in a way that suppresses pest emergence, and that's the direction we have to move in. And then they argue also in there that we aren't just talking about pest management, we're talking about all of our systems, that whether you're a farmer or whether you're a school teacher or whatever, if you're addressing your task as a single tactic therapeutic intervention, you're really not enabling people to understand what's going on in the system that's causing the problem in the first place. And that's the direction we have to move in. So I think this is a brilliant article that I hope everybody, and it's still, all you got to do is Google Joe Lewis, and the article will come up and you can download it and read it. One of the other things that has inspired me recently is Dan Barber, who's a good friend of mine, who's a chef actually, and many of you I'm sure know him or know about him. He has 2 restaurants in New York now, actually one at Stone Barns where I spent part of my time, and one in town. And Dan's published a new book now called The Third Plate. And he argues as a chef now, based on his experience, that the farm-to-table direction, we went from industrial food production to farm-to-table food production, and that was an important transition, but we need to go beyond that now, because what he discovered is that as a chef, of course, what he's primarily concerned about is getting that kind of quality of food which has this exceptional taste that satisfies his customers. And along the way, he discovered that as a chef, the easiest way to accomplish that is to find the farmers who manage their soil for soil health. Because if you grow food on soil that's healthy soil, then you have food that has this incredible taste quality. And then as a chef, all you need to do is prepare this food in a way that allows the natural flavors to express themselves. You don't have to do all the manipulation to get the food to do what you want it to do. And then, of course, and Dan is also very interested when a farmer farms in a way that gets this kind of biologically healthy soil, what does the farmer have to do? So he starts to visit the farms. And one of the key relationships that he had was to Klaus Martens, who's actually pretty close to you here. And Klaus Martens was producing a variety of emmer wheat that was out of this world, and this is what Dan wanted. And so he went to Klaus's farm to see what Klaus was doing in order to produce this emmer wheat, and he discovered that Klaus had to grow some cover crops from which he got no income. He had to have a crop rotation which included millet and barley, which there was no market in the food market, so he had to sell that as animal feed, which he got less money for. And then suddenly Dan realized what he was doing is simply cherry picking this one product from his farm for his own benefit, just like going into a supermarket and just cherry picking some things. And that was not the future of the food system. What we have to learn now is what he called eating from the whole farm. So he started to work with Klaus, and they figured out ways that they could harvest some of the leafy material from the cover crops, which he could use in his salads in the restaurant. And he started to design some menus, or some items in his menu made from the millet and from the barley, so he could actually buy those as food crops from Klaus. And this then suddenly put Klaus into a much better economic situation. And this concept now of eating from the whole farm is becoming popular even in Iowa. Because when people say, we got to deal with farmers differently here. We got to think about what farmers have to do, what we want them to do, and then how do we reward for them for that in the marketplace. And this is a whole new concept, which is going to take some time, I'm sure, to catch on everywhere else. But if it's catching on in Iowa, it can catch on anywhere. So these are the kinds of directions, and again, we could, let me also add one other little bit of good news here that's happening, and that's actually in the business world, because obviously people in the business world have to begin to transform their operations as well. And there are two resources I want to call to your attention, and one is an article that was published in the Harvard Business Review, the January-February 2011 issue, by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, who are two of our leading economists, which is important to keep in mind here. And they wrote this article entitled Creating Shared Value. And that article was written to the business community. And basically what they said in the article of Creating Shared Value, they said, if people in business continue to operate by what they call the old playbook, you're not going to be successful in the future. And operating by the old playbook is getting your labor and your raw materials as cheaply as possible so you can increase your profits in your company, and externalizing as much of your environmental costs and your social costs as possible to increase your profit in your own company. And if you're going to continue to operate by that old playbook, you're not going to be successful in the future. The reason is because our labor and raw materials are now becoming so degraded, you're not going to have the quality of those labor and raw materials for you to continue to be successful in your business. And if you continue to externalize your environmental costs and your social costs, then your social and natural capital in your community is going to deteriorate to a point where you're not going to be able to have a successful business in those communities. So you now have to figure out how you're going to do business on the basis of shared value, of taking all of these issues into consideration in your business plan. And they make a very compelling case for this. And I know that Michael Porter, at least, is now doing some workshops around the country with people in the business community, trying to help them understand why they need to make this kind of transition. And then there's a second resource, which I think is in many ways is equally important. And this is a his name is Andrew Winston. He has started his own company now, which he uses as a consulting firm to work with major corporations, especially in the agriculture and food system. And the title of his book is The Big Pivot, and the subtitle is Radical Practical Strategies for a Hotter, Scarcer, and More Open World. And his point in his book is that if you're in business and you want to be successful in the future, you can't just kind of, make things a little less bad and hope that you can be successful. Because we're now in a situation where we have a hotter world. That's the effects of climate change, which are already affecting our businesses and will continue to do so in the future. We're living in a scarcer world where many of these resources that I talked about are no longer going to be there, so you have to figure out how you're going to redesign your business to operate under those circumstances. And it's a more open world. So if you think you can work your way through this simply with a better job of messaging, you're on the wrong side of history. Because there are now the social media, and if you put out that kind of message and it's not true, somebody will come up with a 10-minute video to expose you, and then it's going to hurt your business. So you now have to make a big pivot turn and fundamentally rethink and reorganize your system. And again, he makes a very compelling case for this. So these things are happening in the business world as well as in the physical world. And I think there's some other things we could talk about here, but maybe we'll get into them in question and answer. But I want to end with one other thing, and that is, I think the role that the arts can play in all of this. Because if we can't imagine a different way of doing things and a better future and become emotionally energized to do that, it's going to be very difficult to see how we're going to make these big pivot turns. And I want to give you just one example of the way in which the arts can be so effective. Kathleen Dean Moore, who is the head of the philosophy department at Oregon State University, and she told me once that when she got into the field of philosophy, she began to realize that philosophers often use such dense language they don't even understand each other, let alone the general public, and she didn't want to be a part of that world. So she started to translate these important philosophical concepts into stories. And in her book, The Pine Island Paradox, at one point where she talks about the difficulties and challenges and damage that we're doing with our wars and with the way in which we're treating our environment, etc., this simply can't go on. So she decides to imagine her granddaughter, writing her a letter from 100 years in the future. And what would she say to her? And here's the story, here's the imaginary letter that she puts out, which I think is a great example of how the arts can be used in such a powerful way. She imagines her granddaughter saying, "How could you not have known? What more evidence did you need that your lives, your comfortable lives, would do so much damage to ours? Did you think that you could wage war against nations without waging war against people and against the earth? Didn't you wonder what we would drink once you had poisoned the aquifers? Didn't you wonder what we would breathe once you had poisoned the air? Did you stop to ask how we would be safe in a world poisoned by war? Did you think that it all belonged to you, this beautiful earth? You who loved your children, did you think that we could live without clean air and healthy cities? You who loved the earth, did you think that we could live without bird song and swaying trees? And if you knew, how could you not care? What could matter to you more than your children and their babies? How could a parent destroy what is life-giving and astonishing in her child's world? And if you knew and if you cared, how could you not act? What excuses did you make? And now, what would you have us do?" And I think this is a powerful kind of statement which can serve to energize us, because it's our grandchildren that's going to inherit the world that we're creating. And so we need to begin to take seriously these kinds of transitions that we have to make, not only in our food and agriculture system, but of course that's critical because we can do without a lot of things in the future, but we can't do without food and water. And so this is what I wanted to leave with you today, and go to some, I'd love to have your concept. And I always say to people, I'm especially interested if I said something you disagree with, because I'm a Russian German, so I haven't had an argument. I haven't had a good day yet. So, but anyway, let's open it up, and then Matt's going to repeat the question so sure everybody hears it.
So let's thank Fred. concept of changing farming, and on a very, what I personally partook was like on a very local scale, like it's on us to do more sustainable farming or go to the farmers. What do you think the role does the corporate farming play in the United States? How does that have to change in the future? Because essentially part of the problem is corporate farming and they manipulate the farmers.
Yeah, well, that's part of one of the things that I didn't address, which we can talk about if you want, is we've got a cultural issue. Because we've all become a part of the industrial economy now, and the culture which sustains that. And Paul Roberts published a book recently called The Impulse Society, in which he makes a very compelling case for the fact that the kind of culture that we live in now is all about mine and now. And of course, our corporate world also lives by that culture and that principle. And so, so we have this kind of economic system now in which each of us feel we have to capture as much for ourselves in the short-term grandizement. And of course, corporations just don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to do business. They will say, how can I create my business in a way that's going to give me the most profit? And that means you have to play out to that kind of culture that's out there, which people want to have the short-term return for themselves. So how do we make culture? How do we change cultural issues? And that's a huge problem. I don't think that's going to happen from the top down. I think these are changes that have to come from the bottom up. And again, one of the things that's encouraging to me is there's a body of literature now that's coming out which is helping us to understand that these cultural transitions need to take place. And, Paul Roberts does a much better job describing the problem than he does coming up with an answer, but nevertheless he points to these in some direction. But Marjorie Kelly, who published a book a few years ago called Owning Our Future, she makes a very compelling case that this economy that we're in now, which she calls the extractive economy, where each of us try to grab as much for ourselves as possible, that's now increasingly becoming dysfunctional. Again, you don't have all the resources to keep that working, and you've got these concentrations of wealth that leave so many people out that it doesn't serve the common good in our community. And then what's starting to evolve now is what she calls the generative economy, where people in communities are starting to work together for what she calls the common flourishing of life. And she gives some practical examples of the kinds of things that are starting to happen in various places. So I think if we can begin to point to some of these generative economy emergence, and some of them are happening actually in agriculture. She points out that where groups of farmers pool their production and have their own brand and establish these relationships with their customers, like Organic Valley and Shepherd's Grain and Mountain Ranch and Natural Country Beef, there's a number of them out there. They're actually now economically much more successful than the corporate individual trying to grab as much as they can for themselves. And just as one example, the average age of our farmers now is 58.3. The average age of the farmers in each of these, I call them values-based value chains, is in their mid-40s and getting younger. So I think as we start to see that there is a success pattern that moves in this other direction that actually is more based on the common good and this generative economy, this common flourishing of life, that actually works better than where each of us try to grab as much as we can for ourselves. And that could begin to take us in the direction of changing our culture. I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow, but at least it's already happening in some places, so that's encouraging. Yeah.
I'm not trying to be cynical. I agree with everything you're saying, but I just wonder about the political economy. Who has power and influence to do this at scale? And I don't see the incentives for business or the politicians that they fund to really change our complete food system, even though it's necessary. So we've seen all of the indicators about climate change, for example. We know it's coming, it's imminent, and yet we're really struggling to actually make significant policy changes to reverse course. There's a huge momentum to keep everything the way that it is, related to the food system, related to urbanization, and our power structure. So how
Yeah.
how do we grapple with that?
Yeah, really important question, and I don't mean to pretend that that's not part of our culture. But here's the other thing that I think we need to pay attention to, and that is that in our current system, which obviously is still working for certain segments of the economy, and if it weren't working for corporations anymore, they wouldn't be doing it anymore. But again, if you start to look at the early indicators of some changes that are taking place, let me just give you a couple of examples. Cargill Corporation is one of the biggest defenders of GMOs in our food system and have contributed to not having any labeling, etc. They've now come out with a non-GMO variety of soy oil. The Hershey Corporation made a decision here a couple of weeks ago that they're going to transition to a total non-GMO approach. Well, why are they doing this? They're doing this because their consuming public is increasingly saying that we want to see some changes in the food system. Now, the important thing, and this is where the power part of it comes in, the important thing about all of this is that if you're in the food business, food customers have a lot more power than if you're in the automobile manufacturing or computer manufacturing business. Because, in fact, we had a cooperative extension individual in Iowa who did a research project, this was about 10 years ago, and she made a case for the fact that she thought that food customers have much more power than any other customers, because if you're a company and you're producing automobiles or computers, as she put it, and if you lose a couple of customers, you can always get your existing customers to upgrade more often or buy a second car or a second computer, etc. If you're in the food business and you lose a customer, you can't just get your current customers to eat more. So people in the food business have a lot of power. So what she did in the course that she was teaching, she asked her students to do a research project. And she asked the students to go to supermarkets and find out how many people had to go into the supermarket and ask the manager for a particular product that they wanted in the same week, or how long would it take in order for that supermarket to start putting the new product on the shelf. And what they found without exception was that if 15 students went into the same supermarket and asked the manager for a particular product, that product would appear on the shelf. And she used that as an example of the power people in the food business have. So here's my view. I mean, I fully agree with you that today our political system is almost entirely controlled by the vested interests. Who are the vested interests? The commodity farm groups. They're the input suppliers, the food processors, all who have made huge investments in the current system. And they've made huge investments in the current system because we all said what we wanted food fast, convenient, and cheap, and that's exactly what they delivered. Now after they've invested billions of dollars, we want to go and say, we'd like to have you make some changes here. Well, it's not going to happen, right? But what is happening and can happen is that instead of us going to them and saying, we'd like to have you make these changes, is working together in our own communities. And as you have more customers that say, this is what we want in our food system, and this incidentally is beginning to happen, particularly in our urban centers, where there is this evolution of what I call food citizens. Bill Heffernan, who he's retired now, but he was a world sociology professor at the University of Missouri and Columbia University. And he's, I think, done more research than anybody else on the concentration at the retail level in food systems, and how it's that concentration which really controls much of the food system. But then, and he told me once, he said, if the industrial food system were to choose an appropriate logo for itself, it would be just eat it. That was the era of the industrial food system. But then he said, that era is rapidly coming to a close. And I think that's very much true now, because now it's not that people are simply passive resistant. People are becoming active and engaging in their own communities. And if you have a large number of people in our urban population centers, where most of these food citizens are, that are starting to say, wait a minute, we want a different kind of food, we want this, we want that. Eventually, our politicians are going to have to pay as much attention to these voting populations as they do to the vested interests. And then we'll have the possibility, I think, of some changes taking place, at that national level from the top down. In the meantime, we've got to be concentrating, working with people from the bottom up. Yes.
Just two quick comments. One is, I think your talk, I really enjoyed your talk. You're talking more about the U.S. context. I work very much in South Asia, where the issues are just the same, but more on the front. But one of the people you didn't mention is that's the farmer. And I always put in my lectures that we've got to produce the food using resources more efficiently. We have to minimize the effect on the environment, but we've got to maintain the livelihoods of the people who actually produce the food. And we all want cheap food. Cheap food is a political thing. And if we don't pay the farmers a fair price for their labor, we're going to have more and more farmers leaving the area, going to the urban areas like we see in India and China. And then what happens? So.
Now, another really great question, and you're right, I was focusing primarily on our current situation in the United States. Again, part of the good news from my perspective of what's starting to happen in the developing world is more of a recognition that for them to adopt the industrial system that we have in the industrial world is not going to serve them well. We've still got some pressure points trying to bring that system to farmers in the developing world. But there's a rapidly growing phenomenon now where farmers themselves are beginning to recognize that the way in which they can be successful in the future is and there's also now 5 UN reports that confirm this, and that is that if you want to really address the issues in the developing world, first of all, you have to work with women, because 70% of the world's farmers in the developing world are women. Secondly, you have to work with them in terms of their local resources and their social capacity for working together in a more ecological kind of approach, where again they use kind of nature's model as a way of producing their food, etc. And so these are things which are the Via Campesina group has been growing pretty rapidly. I was mentioning some people here that I'm working with a young man now who's just 22 years old and lives in New York at the moment, but he has started a nonprofit organization of his own. He's 22 years old, and he just got back last week from spending, I think, 4 weeks in India, 6 weeks in Egypt, and some 8 weeks in Africa. And his whole approach is he knows that there are individual farmers in each of these countries who have already figured this out and already examples of doing this. And so he wants to try to connect other farmers with those farmers so they begin to develop a kind of community approach to this new direction. And I'm going to try to find ways to get some additional support so we can get other people to work with him and help bring that movement to bear. So again, I think there's some things that we can do. But, and then eventually, Lauren is saying this is not only the future for the developing world, it's also eventually the future for the world in the U.S. as we go through the challenges we face. So you're absolutely right, and I didn't mean to exclude the farmer. The only reason that I put the emphasis where I did today is that so often in groups of people who think this is simply a farmer problem, we simply got to convince the farmers they need to make these changes. And I want to help us to understand this is a social issue, it's an ecological issue, and we all have to become engaged in it. But working with the farmers individually, as Lauren is doing, is also very critical. So thanks. Yes.
So the focus on, obviously, production systems are focused on the provisioning ecosystem services, but the other ecosystem services that don't get a lot of attention, some farmers are actually supporting those. Conservation practices contribute to those. So is there a way to compensate or to incentivize those other services that are often ignored?
Of course, yeah. And we actually have a few small programs, like the conservation programs, et cetera, which try to address that, but it's such a minor part of the public support that we can provide. But, a lot of these challenges that I talked about, there are significant roles that the national political system could address with relatively minor funding comparing to the system that we currently subsidize. But again, that's, in my view, it's going to be pretty much a lost cause of thinking we're going to be able to convince people at the national political level, either in Congress or the USDA, to do that, because they're under constant pressure from the vested interest to keep the current system going. So I think we have to bring this about, to bring the pressure about from the bottom up. And this is why my point about the power of individual consumers in bringing about these changes, which we're starting to see already now in major companies starting to, even McDonald's, not that they've gone to where they need to go, but they've gone and made some significant steps in the right direction. So they're hearing pressure from, their customers, starting to pay attention to that. So I think that's a better way to move. Not that we should ignore, USDA or these other issues and continue to, and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is a lobbying group in Washington, are doing some really good work to exactly address the kinds of things you're talking about and get more funding for conservation efforts, et cetera. But they're operating in this climate where what they can accomplish is pretty limited and important. But I want them to see, continue to be business, effective, and I continue to support them. And we all need to do that, but we shouldn't expect that suddenly to change the world. Wish I had better news for you on the short term, but on the long term, the issues on our side. Yeah.
So a lot of us are scientists, so we're all developing science that changes the technologies that affect the production systems that farmers will be using. Presumably they can change those production systems in ways that you might find favorable, or that you might find sort of more regenerative or sort of more extractive. I think it's difficult to tell at the outset which way we're going. I mean, so my daughter from the future, my granddaughter from the future, who is writing to me and asking why didn't I act, I would say, well, I'm doing my best and trying to figure it out, right? But so, do you have ways of helping people to figure out, like, or what kind of tests, thought experiments do you propose people in the science that they're doing to sort of think about the direction that their science leads to?
Yeah, you all have really great questions, and again, I think I always try to look for where are the little pieces of good news that could address what we're talking about. And for me, I experience this a lot in my work at the Stonewater Center, also other at Iowa State University. We've got this new generation of millennials, and I don't want to romanticize this. I don't want to present this as though all of them have gotten Jesus and we're going in the right direction. But there is a growing population of people that are really in a very different direction than I just described. Because they recognize this is their future, this is their world. And so, example I like to use, I used earlier yesterday, the young couple that's managing our horticulture farming operation, Jack and Shannon, they have 2 young boys. I think they're now 5 years old or 6 years old, 13 years old. They would no more think of taking their boys to a shopping mall for picking them up in the garden. When you see these 2 kids out in the garden, food at their big smiles on their faces, and then taking that food home to their parents who to prepare a meal. This is what makes them feel important and fulfilled. And it's their parents who are really part of this millennial generation who recognize that these are the values that they want for their children, because that's what's going to put them in a better position to meet the challenges of the future. And they're not an isolated case. And, I would tell people my first American history course was when I was a junior in high school. And on the first day of our class, our
teacher got up in front of us, a young guy, could have been more than 25 years old. He got up in front of us and he said, I want you all to understand that only 20% of the American colonists were in favor of the American Revolution. And he said, the reason I want you to understand that is because the reason you should study history is so that you can learn from the past how you apply the lessons from the past to your future. So he said, if any of you are interested in bringing about changes, you don't need 100%, you only need 20%. I've always remembered that. And so, you know, as I think about this millennial generation now with these different kind of values which they have and that they're trying to instill in their children, I'm wondering, you know, do we have 20% out there yet? I don't know. Nobody's done surveys as far as I know. But I do know in my own engagement and involvement in the various enterprises that I've done, both at Iowa State University, at Snowcross Center, and other places that I've been, I keep running into more and more these young people who are in their early, mid-20s, early 30s. And there are so many of them, at least, that are already in this new culture. So I take, again, great inspiration from that. And I think part of my responsibility is what can I do more and more to support them kind of the world of engaging. So I don't have a better answer to your question than that. But again, the fact that this is already happening, I think, is something we can support. And the more that we can do that, may be a better indicator of the kind of changes that we want to see and that we want to see than trying to convince the Department of Agriculture to suddenly change.
So I think we're already over time a little bit. I think Fred will be here for a couple minutes, so if we want to just break now and thank Fred again, and then he'll be around for a couple minutes.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.